Snow didn't just fall on the dark streets of the city. It felt like a cold shroud descending over the empire Adam Bond had spent a decade staining with blood. At 32, the ruthless kingpin of the Bond syndicate had grown accustomed to the silence of the night, a silence he controlled through fear, and a reputation carved in stone. His tailored black overcoat was more than just wool. It was armor against a world that had tried to break him, a dark shell that matched the ink creeping up his neck. Success had come to Adam at a terrible price, leaving him with absolute power but an empty heart he considered a necessary casualty of his trade. He was stepping toward his armored vehicle, his mind already calculating the next move in a territory war, when a jagged, desperate sob sliced through the icy wind. "Mama won't wake up, sir." Adam froze, his hand tightening on the door handle. He looked down to find a tiny girl, no more than 4 years old, standing in the drift. She was a small flicker of life in the gloom, wearing a bright green puffer jacket that seemed far too thin for the blizzard. Her dark braids were dusted with white, her cheeks were raw from the biting cold, and her small hands trembled as she reached for his. The girl, Lena, looked up at him with eyes that held an emotion Adam hadn't seen in years, not in his enemies, and certainly not in the mirror. It was the kind of raw, gut-wrenching grief that turned the city's most feared man deathly pale. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom clicked shut, sealing away the stifling scent of expensive cologne and simmering hostility. Adam Bond exhaled, his breath hitching in the frigid air of the corridor. Outside, the city was disappearing under a relentless, silent shroud of white. He moved with a practiced, predatory grace, his expression a fortress of indifference that had earned him a reputation for being made of ice rather than flesh. He was nearly at the exit when a flash of movement stalled him. Lena stood braced against the stone pillar, her frame trembling. When she turned, the fluorescent lights caught the wet tracks on her cheeks. Adam's internal machinery, usually so precise and unyielding, ground to a sudden jarring halt. That famous, ruthless composure, the mask he wore to survive the sharks inside, didn't just crack, it shattered. The biting wind howled through the open foyer, but he didn't feel the cold. He only felt the sharp, inconvenient ache of a man who realized, far too late, that there was one person left in the world who could still make him bleed. The elevator had groaned all the way to the top floor, but the air inside Lena's apartment was even thinner. It was a skeletal space, smelling of damp wool and the metallic tang of a radiator that had long since given up the ghost. Adam stepped over a threshold of cracked linoleum, his tailored suit an insult to the peeling wallpaper and the single, flickering bulb overhead. In the corner, a narrow cot held the frail, gray silhouette of a woman. Lena's mother lay unconscious, her breath a rattling ghost of a sound that barely stirred the pilled blankets. Adam's gaze swept the room, landing on the cluster of dampened rags and the lukewarm bowls of water on the floor. It wasn't just poverty, it was a battlefield. The unreliability he had prepared to scold her for was exposed as a grueling, lonely vigil. Lena hadn't been hiding. She had been drowning in the responsibility of a life she couldn't afford to save. Looking at the hollows under Lena's eyes, Adam felt his icy pragmatism melt into a cold, hard knot of shame. Adam didn't ask for permission. He simply took up the space in the cramped room, his presence a jagged intrusion against the silence. He pulled his phone from his pocket, the sleek glass surface reflecting the dim, flickering light of the apartment like a weapon. With a few sharp taps, he bypassed the standard emergency lines, dialing a private number that most people spent their entire lives trying to acquire. When the voice on the other end answered, smooth, professional, and dripping with the caution one reserved for a man of Adam's volatile influence, Adam didn't lead with a greeting. He led with a command. "I need a cardiac team and a private transport at this address in 10 minutes, he said, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous register that usually signaled a corporate takeover. "If you're a second late, I'll find a new chief of medicine for your foundation by sunrise." He didn't wait for a response before ending the call and immediately dialing the administrator of St. Jude's private wing. The man on the other end began to stutter about protocols, bed availability, and the proper intake channels for someone without a prior file. Adam leaned against the peeling wallpaper, his eyes fixed on the unconscious woman on the cot. Listen to me very carefully, Adam interrupted, his tone chillingly calm. I own 3 of the buildings in your expansion project, and I have enough board seats to make your tenure a historical footnote. You will have the premiere suite prepped. You will have the head of neurology waiting at the door. If I see a single clipboard or a hint of protocol before she is stabilized, I will personally ensure you never manage so much as a lemonade stand in the city again. He tucked the phone away, the silence returning to the room, though it felt different now, charged with the static of his intervention. Lena was staring at him, her face a mask of shock and a growing, fragile hope that she seemed terrified to touch. Adam looked at his hands, realizing they were steady for the first time all day. For years, he had used his wealth and his capacity for cruelty to crush competitors and dismantle legacies, earning the Ruthless moniker with every signature. He had always viewed his power as a cold, sharp blade. Now, for the first time, he realized that the same edge used to cut could also be used to carve out a space for someone to survive. It was an evil kind of influence, born of threats and systemic leverage. But as he watched the distant sirens begin to wail through the snow, he didn't care about the morality of the means. For the first time, the monster in the suit was fighting for something that mattered. The mansion felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum of cold marble and sharp edges. As Adam stepped into the vaulted foyer, the silence he usually craved felt suddenly oppressive. Beside him, Lena was a shadow of herself, but it was the small, trembling weight of the 4-year-old in her arms that truly unmoored him. The girl's eyes were wide, darting toward the cavernous shadows of the hallway as if the house itself might swallow her whole. I want my blankie, the child whispered, her voice a fragile reed against the high ceilings. It's too dark, Mommy. I want my blankie. Adam froze, his lethal instincts utterly useless against a toddler's terror. He had dismantled Fortune 500 companies with a glare, yet he stood paralyzed by the realization that the blankie was likely still in that freezing apartment. The girl's lip wobbled, a precursor to a storm he wasn't prepared to weather. Taking a breath that felt like swallowing glass, the man the world called a monster knelt on the expensive stone. He reached out, his hand hovering awkwardly before he gestured toward the glow of the library. The dark doesn't live here, he said, his voice a gravelly command that softened despite itself. And we'll get your blanket. I'll send a car for it right now. The obsidian desk was a stark contrast to the neon chaos unfolding upon it. Adam sat shirtless, his torso a dark map of jagged ink and old scars, while 3 of his personal security details stood like stone monoliths against the mahogany walls. Their eyes remained fixed on the door, yet their professional stoicism flickered as they watched the small girl meticulously repair their employer. With the gravity of a seasoned surgeon, she peeled a glittery, pink-filmed bandage and pressed it firmly over a coiled serpent on Adam's bicep. "This one's a big boo-boo," she whispered, her brow furrowed in concentration. Adam didn't flinch. The man who had once dismantled a rival's empire over a single phone call now sat perfectly still, his lethal frame adorned with cartoon stars and neon hearts. One of the guards cleared his throat, a sound of strangled disbelief, but Adam's cold, warning gaze snapped toward him, silencing the room instantly. He turned back to the child, his voice dropping into a rare, gentle cadence. "Better?" he asked. She nodded, patting a bright yellow band-aid over a jagged scar on his shoulder. In that moment, the monster was being mended by the only medicine he couldn't buy. The obsidian desk was a stark contrast to the neon chaos unfolding upon it. Adam sat shirtless, his torso a dark map of jagged ink and old scars, while 3 of his personal security details stood like stone monoliths against the mahogany walls. Their eyes remained fixed on the door, yet their professional stoicism flickered as they watched the small girl meticulously repair their employer. With the gravity of a seasoned surgeon, she peeled a glittery, pink-filmed bandage and pressed it firmly over a coiled serpent on Adam's bicep. "This one's a big boo-boo," she whispered, her brow furrowed in concentration. Adam didn't flinch. The man who had once dismantled a rival's empire over a single phone call now sat perfectly still, his lethal frame adorned with cartoon stars and neon hearts. One of the guards cleared his throat, a sound of strangled disbelief, but Adam's cold, warning gaze snapped toward him, silencing the room instantly. He turned back to the child, his voice dropping into a rare, gentle cadence. "Better?" he asked. She nodded, patting a bright yellow band-aid over a jagged scar on his shoulder. In that moment, the monster was being mended by the only medicine he couldn't buy. The ledger of Sarah's life was a frantic scrawl of predatory interest and hollow threats. Adam sat in the dim light of his study, staring at the crumpled notices he'd recovered from the apartment. A low-level bottom feeder had been squeezing the marrow from a dying woman's bones for a debt that wouldn't cover the tires on Adam's car. His first instinct was a familiar, dark heat, to send his men to erase the problem from the city's concrete. But as he looked at the neon band-aid still clinging to his thumb, the impulse shifted. Violence was a temporary fix. He wanted a permanent erasure. He picked up the secure line, his voice a cold scalpel. "Buy the building, evict the shark, then prep the estate in the valley." He wasn't just paying a debt. He was relocating their entire reality. No more damp basements or rattling radiators. He would move them to a fortress of sunlight and security where the shadows of their past couldn't find the gate. It was a total life relocation, a godlike intervention that felt more terrifyingly powerful than any hit he'd ever ordered. The air in the private club was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the unspoken threat of a mutiny. His associates sat in a semicircle of shadowed leather, their eyes tracking the neon-pink adhesive still clinging to Adam's cuff. "The docks are stalled, Adam," his second-in-command muttered, the edge in his voice unmistakable. "And you're playing house in a valley estate. The streets think you've gone soft. They think the lion has been declawed by a child." Adam looked at the men who had bled for him, their loyalty as cold and transactional as the city itself. He could feel the familiar, ruthless machine in his chest begin to roar, ready to silence them with a single, devastating order. It would be so easy to slide back into the skin of the monster, to let the ice take over and forget the smell of damp plaster and the weight of a sleeping 4-year-old. But then he felt the phantom ghost of a glittery band-aid on his scarred skin. He stood slowly, the silence in the room turning brittle. "The lion hasn't changed," Adam said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that froze the air. "He just found something worth more than your docks." 3 years had passed since the snow on Fifth Avenue had nearly claimed a life, and instead forged a new one. The bond syndicate still functioned with its trademark efficiency, but the air within the limestone walls of Adam's sprawling mansion had fundamentally shifted. Where there was once only the sterile, oppressive silence of marble and shadow, there was now the chaotic, vibrant pulse of a home. A bright red tricycle sat parked haphazardly beneath a Renaissance-era tapestry, and a stray plush rabbit rested on the mahogany desk where Adam once signed orders that decided the fate of the city's underworld. Adam stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his black silk shirt rolled at the sleeves to reveal the intricate ink that marked his skin. The tattoos were still there, a map of a violent history, but they were often obscured now by the colorful, sticky handprints of a child who saw him only as Uncle Adam. He watched as Lena, now 7 and taller, chased a golden retriever across the manicured lawn, her braids flying behind her as she shrieked with a joy that was once entirely foreign to these grounds. Sarah walked into the room, looking radiant and healthy, a far cry from the hollow-eyed woman Adam had found on a freezing apartment floor. She had become the cornerstone of his new reality, managing the syndicate's legitimate holdings with a sharp intelligence that matched his own. They didn't speak of the debt anymore. It had long since been replaced by a quiet, fierce loyalty that transcended blood. As Adam watched Lena trip, laugh, and scramble back to her feet, he felt a strange, grounding weight in his chest. For years, he had measured his power by the number of men who feared him and the territory he held under his thumb. He had built towers of glass and steel as armor against a world that had taken everything from him when he was young. But looking at the small, brave girl who had once walked into a blizzard to save her mother, he realized he had been playing a pauper's game. True wealth wasn't found in the ledgers or the respect won through intimidation. It was found in the privilege of being the one who stood between a family and the cold. He was still a boss, and the city still whispered his name in the dark, but his empire was no longer built on fear. It was built on the sanctuary he had created for the 2 people who had dared to ask a monster for help. Adam Bond finally understood that real power wasn't the ability to take a life. It was having a life worth protecting.